neighborhoods, businesses, and the environment. Great. Thank you. We're always looking for new members. So if you're interested, all of the seats have 2 alternates, and I don't think some of the alternate seats are filled. Everyone, I think, has the second alternate seat open. So if you're interested, the neighborhoods along North and Northeast Minneapolis, the neighborhoods along the river have a seat, and then there are some general seats for the various areas of the city. It's a little complicated, so if you want to know more, see any of those people who stood up. This is also co-sponsored by the Mississippi River, say the new name, Riverfront Partnership. We just changed the name, Minneapolis Riverfront Partnership, and Cordelia will speak in a moment. We're really excited to have you here. Those of us on the APPAC have been working on river issues for about 12 years officially, and many of us for 20, 25 years before that. So it's really exciting, and I think you'll have fun, and we'll talk a little more later in the evening. Cordelia Pearson, Executive Director of the Minneapolis Riverfront Partnership.
Thank you all. It's really a pleasure to be here on the riverfront, bringing down upriver, another river expert, Tim Griffin. But this seems a perfect kickoff to our series this spring and summer, the Upper River series, Creating a Great River City Legacy. And the reason we're sponsoring this series together with the Above the Falls Citizen Advisory Committee is that there are many exciting things happening and proposed for the Mississippi River in Minneapolis. And many organizations are committed to providing a way for people to learn more about what's going on. The Above the Falls Citizen Advisory Committee is a standing committee. If you go on the city's website, you'll learn more about it. And for people who want to be more involved in river leadership, that's a great opportunity. The Minneapolis Riverfront Partnership was created by the legislature and the city back in 2008. We just celebrated our annual meeting just downstairs tonight, and we're very happy to say as a nonprofit organization there's a lot of energy and enthusiasm about the river in Minneapolis. So this Upper River series, as I said before, this is the first one, and we're happy to host Tim Griffin. Tim brings to us expertise from Jacksonville, from Chicago, and even from Red Wing, Minnesota, here to Minneapolis. He serves as the director of the St. Paul on the Mississippi Riverfront Design Center at the St. Paul Riverfront Corporation. And we're very happy to recognize him also as part of the winning team in the recent design competition for the Mississippi Riverfront. So I spoke to Tim recently and said, you know, we want to get people inspired to learn from other cities, which is the topic in April, but also to see the riverfront as key to the health of our whole region. He said, yep, I know all about that. I'd be delighted to share those ideas. And he just shared with me tonight as well that he lives right on the river. So hopefully he'll share some exciting stories about what it means to look out his window and see the river surging right now. So with that, thank you, Tim, for joining us tonight. And actually, I promised that I'd make one more announcement for him. Excited about riverfronts? Well, our sister city, St. Paul, is conducting an amazing Great River Park Master Plan. They have an open house on April 14th in the evening. So save the date if you want to learn from our sister city. So no further ado, Tim Griffin.
Okay, I think we're ready to go here. So a little bit of my travels from Minneapolis to St. Paul. The first time I was in Minneapolis was in 1985, and I was part of a group in Chicago called Friends of the Chicago River, and we came up and talked at a conference. I think it was the International River Design Conference, and it was right about the time Friends of Mississippi River was being formed. And I continued to work in Chicago, and then moved to the Twin Cities in 1991. Actually lived near Lake Harriet for about 17 years, and then after working in the Riverfront Corporation in St. Paul, moved down to the Upper Landing Project. So today I live on Lake Harriet again, because Harriet Island has been a lake for the last last few days, and we think it's going to crest tomorrow. As Pat Nunley said, the first crest. So it's going to be an interesting spring. But one of the great parts about living on the river is that you really become connected to it. And the opportunity to start working at the Riverfront Corporation about 10 years ago was really an opportunity for me professionally. I'm an architect and city planner by training. Been a consultant for 20 years prior to that, and this was an opportunity to work on the river in downtown St. Paul every day. And so instead of going to conferences and showing drawings and things, we get to go and show projects that we've built over time. So it's pretty gratifying in that regard. I wanted to title the talk today, the Mississippi River as the Twin Cities advantage. It's one of the great landscapes. And I've prepared some remarks here that look at the idea really in three pieces. The first is the tradition of placemaking in the Twin Cities. Talk a little bit about the regional landscape and our aspirations to kind of plan up the region that's been part of this area for over 100 years, and then talk about national competitiveness. And I'm not really going to wait until the third part to talk about competitiveness, but I'm going to kind of weave that through all three sections. So first, in terms of the placemaking tradition, it's the way we create and sustain our physical setting as a place to live, work, learn, and celebrate. And it really comes across in three ways. A community-held vision or framework with a set of principles, ability to advance projects in a apparently cohesive and complementary fashion, so they add up to a greater sum than the parts, and then kind of universal experiences and enjoyment of the facilities after they're finished. Now, that may be a little bit like an academic definition. It could be an architect's definition. It's actually paraphrased from an economic development site selection consultant that was in St. Paul a few weeks ago, talking about how to make St. Paul and the Twin Cities more competitive in the area of attracting businesses to the region. So I couldn't do any better, and so I've been using it since I heard him say it, and I think it really does embrace the three areas. And if you think about, and we'll talk about competitive cities that we're competing against later, they've all to some degree embraced that, and the cities that aren't doing as well struggle in that regard. Well, we certainly have a placemaking tradition here. A lot of it is around, it goes back, that I'll talk about Theodore Wirth and the Grand Round system, Horace Cleveland's work, and so on and so forth. But the first part that the consultant talked about was this idea of a framework and principles for, and a vision for an area, in this case, a tighter area of the city and downtown, but it can really be downtown St. Paul, but can be really extended throughout the region at larger scale. And a lot of it has to do with a lens, not prescriptive in terms of telling people how to connect with our environment, our economic environment, our physical environment, our cultural environment, but rather to give kind of a list of principles that they can use as performance criteria, if you will. So a proposal might talk about how it fits into the Twin Cities ethic, how it deals with ecology, how it improves connections to other neighborhoods, and so on and so forth. So it really is a reference point that a conversation can evolve around. And I think a really important point is that in a way this audience, you, other neighborhoods, are kind of trained in this narrative or this lexicon, if you will, and can engage in that kind of a conversation at a general principle level, how that can affect the landscape, and then see how the parks fit together, but with some confidence that if the principles are being addressed up front, that there's potential for good outcome. Again, the tradition, and I started to mention a few names earlier, but going back over 100 years, the idea of Horace Cleveland's work on the Grand Rounds, the Theodore Wirth, Cass Gilbert, working not only on the state capitol, but also at the University of Minnesota. More recently, Ben Thompson, and I don't know if you are aware, although he's an East Coast, a Cambridge architect, is a native of St. Paul, kind of the author of the Great River Park discussion, really. And then later with Bill Morrish, Ken Greenberg, and up through today with Cordelia's announcement of the Great River Park consulting work that Bill Wenk from Denver is doing, a noted stormwater management landscape architect and sculptor, really, I think is a nice way to describe his work. And then certainly the new River First initiative here in Minneapolis with Tom Leader and KVA from Cambridge. So this environment is, I think we kind of, I don't know if we can do it ourselves or are confident enough to do it ourselves, but really appreciate the conversation that some of these outsiders can bring on a periodic basis. And if you look back, there's quite a tradition of that occurring. So even on the slide that you see here, they look remarkably similar, except there's about 100 years between them. The one on the left was actually a citizens committee, and this is a proposal by a railroad executive in Stickney in St. Paul in 1910 on how to organize the riverfront boulevards and the railroads, of course. But it is noticeable from its continuation of the idea of the grand rounds and so forth. The image on the right is our current working map, the starting map for the idea of the Great River Park, the 17 miles of the river in St. Paul. And in fact, the Stickney version is probably a little bit more ambitious in some ways, including an Upper Bluff Parkway. Excuse me. An Upper Bluff Parkway that really creates a double terrace and ties into the lower level Shepherd Road River Parkway system. Again, just continuing this 100-year comparison or break. The image on the left is a celebration associated with the opening of the lagoon bridge between Lake Calhoun and Lake Harriet. And some of the same people were out last year on the Mississippi River, or maybe their descendants, at the Flutog in downtown St. Paul on Harriet Island and Upper Landing Park. Another piece of the placemaking tradition, and this came about really in the early 1990s, but the idea of looking at the watersheds as a planning tool for the river corridor. Bill Morrish was here at the University of Minnesota at that time, and really started a whole conversation and dialogue about using watersheds and sub-watersheds to define neighborhoods and connections to the Mississippi River. The drawing on the right shows the downtown portion in St. Paul extending up to Lake Phelan and Trout Brook to the north. All those are very common components now, but that was really pretty radical just 15 years ago when that conversation was introduced. And it's a wonderful organizing element. The fan document there is a piece that we've put together. I think Scott Freeland brought his copy of the BMP cards that the McKnight Foundation funded the Riverfront Corporation put together. And it's an exercise in terms of how do you work in these watersheds to improve water quality in the Mississippi River. The image on the top on the right here is a little bit of the conversation from the Tom Leader presentation, but also dealing with the native cultures in terms of spiritual sites and sacred places in the valley. The diagram on the bottom is an early discussion that was brought forward in the early Great River Park planning exercise, and it's pretty amazing that you can see the axes from from Mounds Park in downtown clear down the river to Fort Snelling. It's a pretty powerful place. But the real I think the real gem in the Twin Cities is the idea of the grand of the Grand Round system. It's spectacular in both its breadth, but also in terms of, at a period of time, evolving from kind of the formalized parks that you see in Burnham's Boulevard system in Chicago, and the central parks that you saw farther east in Detroit and Chicago. And this is really the beginning of the kind of the natural landscape movement, where we followed river courses, Minnehaha Creek, and then even the formality up in the upper left of the Victory Memorial. But I think this is, in a way, it's not taught as forcibly, perhaps, as the Wacker Manual in Chicago was used to teach about the Chicago plan. But in a way, I think the tradition of neighborhood planning in the Twin Cities and Minneapolis in particular, you can really think about, and in fact, many of the conversations happen around these segments of the Grand Round. And I think there's a lot of assurance that if you were working, for example, on the Victory Memorial leg, or as we are now on the above the falls area, you can see both that if you attend to the principles that we talked about earlier, you're going to be able to insert it into a wonderful open space system. And in fact, I think we're about poised for a conversation. I think people have been very vigorously working on these little 4 and 5 mile segments of the Grand Rounds at various points. But really, the idea of when you introduce the river into this, it starts to raise some other opportunities. And in fact, the fact that the river has kind of come along at the late end of the Grand Rounds development, after Minnehaha Creek and after the chain of lakes and the other connections, the missing link to the east, which is constantly talked about, really gives us an opportunity, I think, to start looking at some of these as subsystems. And frankly, you can't really get between Minneapolis and St. Paul on the river much faster than you could when the Grand Excursion came in 1854. Obviously, the dams have replaced the rapids, but that is not part of the river experience here, being able to get in any fashion between downtown Minneapolis, say, and downtown St. Paul on the river. It's a nice vacation if you want to take a weekend, but it's certainly not part of the infrastructure. But what this does do is starts to introduce the scale of a regional landscape, and I'd like to bring a few images forward here. The image on the right is the MNRA map. It's the 72 miles of the Mississippi Natural River and Recreation Area. We'll have a quiz on what MNRA means. I always pause before I say it, even before the movie about the great speech recently. But it is a national park, and it's a 72-mile kind of armature that we can look to, just as the Grand Rounds, of making this investment that will eventually be connected. Almost as elegant, perhaps, as I think Theodore Wirth's drawing in, I think, around 1930 or so on the left, where he proposed a western suburban park system that, in conjunction with MnDOT, the Minnesota Department of Transportation. So, just the fact that MNRA is now focusing on the river, there is still the counterpart or the opportunity to expand the creeks, as I mentioned earlier, with the watershed districts and their interests as well as the river going forward. This translates, again, 100 years ago, people said that we had the best park system in the world and the best transit system in the world. During that intervening 100 years, we sort of lost that system that's shown in the top illustration that stretched from Lake Minnetonka over to the St. Croix River. But as you see below, we're trying to rebuild some semblance of that. So the transportation component, the open space system component are part of the DNA of the region. So is celebrating the region and arriving by boat. The 1854 Grand Excursion, the War Eagle, stopped at St. Paul in the top, and then the 2004 reenactment of that. Now this is, I'll make this connection here with the kind of the regional competitiveness model. In a sense, that the Grand Excursion in 1854 was a fam tour. It was a way of Rock Island Railroad introducing investment possibilities both on their new line that extended to the Mississippi at Rock Island and then boarded riverboats to come up to Minneapolis and St. Paul. So part of it is the impression that the region made and then that was really broadcast or in effect written about in the papers. A little skullduggery notwithstanding, and the problems of renting carriages to get from St. Paul to Minneapolis and see St. Anthony Falls, which kind of tainted the image to a degree. But nonetheless, and that was the time also where you still couldn't make that connection by river. So that's over that period of time that does not happen. Into contemporary times, the Itasca project, who many of you are familiar with, has been working on major issues of transportation, public health, education, and has looked at this notion of how does the Twin Cities stand in the kind of the area of national, an option nationally for companies to locate here. Not to overstate it, it doesn't, basically. Or it doesn't come in very highly, especially when compared with cities like Charlotte, Kansas City, and Austin, which are all going to great lengths to attract and try to move people into the region. We think, and in fact, back to my opening story about the site selection consultant when he came to town, being very impressed with the physical setting once he got here. So the challenge really is to get people here, and I think that's a big part in terms of from the urban design side, and we've had conversations over the past year. Our goal is help people coming to town, to the area, to envision what it would be like for them to live and work and hire folks in the Twin Cities, and to move that along on a competitive fashion. Now, it's moved forward in a way in terms of being a little bit more high tech, perhaps. This is a photograph of the Austin showroom in terms of how that message is conveyed. Obviously, you have to be here in Austin to see this, but this is also part of a strategy to project out nationally and attract attention. And we're really contemplating putting something like this together. It's a lot of the way that we've worked in the past, and in fact, Tom Fisher, who many of you know, has been on the board of the Riverfront Corporation for quite a while, and the whole reorganization of the College of Design is based around this concept of design thinking that is really catching hold. But it's a nice metaphor for looking at how business, technology, and people interact. And in the diagram here, the overlapping areas are where functional innovation happens between people and technology, where process innovation happens between business and technology, and where emotional attachment and investment happen between business and people, and the growth that engenders. And I think that's always been a hallmark of the Twin Cities, and we have anecdotal stories of companies like Lawson Software locating on the Mississippi River in downtown St. Paul, so their employees can be part of the riverfront experience. So and so on and so forth. But the quality of life that the Twin Cities offers, and I guess the focus on winter also that we've been having as a year-round environment, really appeals to many people, and our job is to get the message out for that. My personal suggestion is to take a 15-year-old to Europe whenever you can, and I think what that really talks about is having the next generation be excited about their city. I think more importantly, and obviously I'm very biased, but being excited about cities in general, and certainly not being afraid of them, and ideally just being curious. As we have kind of bizarre discussions at the legislature about kind of competing lifestyles and investment philosophies. This city building is really a nonpartisan kind of effort, and it's very difficult for it to get caught up in 4-year swings of on and off. And I think that if we look back at the legacy of the Twin Cities, the Grand Round system, the new work that's being done in St. Paul and above the falls, and the opportunity for our children to enjoy it, I think is as good a formula as we can come up with. So, thank you. So we're certainly we're going to have time for quite a few discussion and questions here. Cordelia's going to join me up here. But I would maybe just throw out as a starter, and I like to have people's comments. You think you can get by boat quickly between Minneapolis and St. Paul? Is that a possibility?
20 minutes.
20 minutes?
Well, depends on if there's a barge or a lock, yeah.
We've got microphones too, so everyone can hear.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can, yeah, there's 2 locks, and there are no large barges. You have to wait if you're in a small boat or even a canoe. You know, on a powerboat, you can make it in, I think you can make it 30 minutes. I think I've done it, but it probably has also taken me an hour and a half to get back if the right conditions, or the wrong conditions that are there.
Just like that, say about 1960, you could get from the Milwaukee Depot to Union Station in St. Paul by train in about 10 minutes.
If people heard that, the timing of apparently do that trip by Union Depot from Union Depot to Milwaukee Depot in 10 minutes back in the 60s or so. And I think the LRT system that's gradually coming online is slowly starting to knit that together. There was an article recently that talked about airports as the center of cities in the 21st century, and it's in a way the way that if you're familiar with how Fort Snelling was formed, with the government preserve along it that didn't allow development outside, we came up with our geography. And if that mandate hadn't been in place, like Pittsburgh or Chicago or Detroit, the Twin Cities could have been at Fort Snelling. That would have been a logical place to build it. So now our airport is at the center of that, and so it's maybe in the 21st century it'll work out as a better deal. Other questions, comments?
I'm curious if many of you have done the Mississippi River Challenge and paddled the whole Mississippi. Any hands? It's an annual event Friends of the Mississippi River organizes, and if you haven't done it, it really does tie together the 2 cities, but starting from the rural area, coming into the city, and then going by Fort Snelling, and then into the urban area again, and then down to a very rural area. And it gives you a much better sense of the Mississippi National River Recreation Area being a thread that ties together this whole region in a great variety. Who sponsors that? Friends of the Mississippi River, and July 30th and 31st is the date, and you can sign up on the website, or you can go watch at various points. Bassett Creek is a regular stopping point there. So.
It might be interesting just to hear some comments about this notion. Maybe just a show of hands or some of stories of how many people have participated in segments of the Grand Round planning there. Maybe describe, get close to the microphones perhaps, maybe describe a little bit about that and how you see it fitting into the larger system, or are you just focused, is it just your neighborhood park? Is it just your neighborhood park?
Well, I think as bicycling becomes such a great sport, great urban sport, it becomes more vital that people can, what I think is so great about the Grand Rounds, at least I live by Lake of the Isles, so I feel really lucky. I get, I can walk there, I can walk to Cedar Lake. But what I see is that these bicycle routes are both recreational and they function as commuter routes. And that, I think, is pretty rare in the United States. So they have this, they cut through the grid, they really enable you to get somewhere quickly and in this beautiful park kind of environment.
I think, that's a whole other layer to put that bike system on the Midtown Greenway and the connections that's making. It also, there's a question over here. There's also, it kind of transfers you from a kind of a one segment resident or neighbor into your bike trips could easily be, the lakes and the creek, and then the idea of the loops. And I'd like to hear what people have to say about the point about the river being kind of late to this. It's really the newest segments of the river and of the system. I don't know if, although Cleveland did work on this portion here and other parts, it wasn't as emphasized as the lake was.
I have a question, comment, and it relates to the last two questions. In North and Northeast, the challenge is we don't have any continuous trails. So we might have 500 feet of trail in one part and then nothing, so it's even hard for people to visualize the trail being continuous as opposed to just a park sidewalk or something. So part of it is, it's a 50-year plan, and if it takes that long to get the trail done, it's hard for people to think about it being a continuous trail. And that relates also that it's the river, and we're the last to get the piece done. So it is a challenge to even envision it, let alone support it.
I was going to pick up on the comments about the Mississippi River and biking and recent planning endeavors. And I recently worked for the Department of Transportation on the Mississippi River Trail Bikeway. And talk about the river maybe being late to the game, but that is an organizing principle for a bicycle route all the way from Lake Itasca down to the Gulf of Mexico. And that bicycle route does exist here in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And so if you don't know it's there, it is an organizing principle, and there are maps now available on MnDOT's website as well for where that route is. So most definitely an organizing principle for the whole country in terms of biking on the river.
Well, the idea of putting the MnRA map up, that 72 miles is in the perhaps mid to longer term, really is a pretty reasonable metric to start using here, I think, because there are enough, segments coming in locally that that approach could be taken further.
I think many of you probably live on the riverfront, and Tad, I'll bring you the microphone next. And how many of you have stopped and talked to people? I've heard voices and languages that I don't recognize, and people from Romania, and people from Brazil, and people who come to our region to see the Mississippi River. And it's fascinating, actually, to see how people who aren't native to this area see the river as defining a region perhaps more than we do, who think of, city and place being in our emblem. What I'd encourage us to think about, too, though, is what would it take to have that be completed? What small pieces, as somebody said, people are disinclined to change unless there's some pressure to change in some way. What is it going to take to get this completed in the upper river? The focus is Pat.
Well, I would suggest that one of the things that will achieve that goal, and speak to what Mary was saying, is that if you see this as a loop, it's a big bike loop. What about the people who don't go that far? So you've got the Midtown Greenway, you've kind of got Summit, you don't really have Lexington. St. Paul is fond of saying nobody in the city lives farther than 4 miles from the Mississippi, but they don't yet have the blank spots connected as well. You've got something that is around, but to build that initiative and to build that support, you've got to build across. And that's, while it's about the river, it's
across,
about, exactly.
Like this?
Exactly.
Okay. So 26th Avenue North or 22nd to
exactly.
Central.
All of those are maybe as important now as the throughway and the round. We got the easy stuff done, but to maintain the easy stuff, you've got to do the harder parts.
So I want to add to one of these things. Many of you have probably been seeing census information coming out, and how is our region changing? Well, one of the things that really stood out, and I'll credit Steve Berg for kind of highlighting this for me in MinPost, is that if you look at our region compared to other regions, we have a greater difference between the haves and have-nots in our region than we do compared to other regions we compete with, the Portlands, the Seattles. If you look at our region, especially in the central core, there's a greater difference in wealth and well-being and health with those communities than the suburbs. What is the difference for us is our river. Our river goes through those areas. And what an opportunity for reinvestment, for creating quality of life. So if you look at the upper river, but then the connections across, as Pat said, can be just as important. But I'd love feedback about that. I mean, that's an idea. What do you think of that?
Thank you. I didn't have a question. I had more of a comment. I think that Tim really recognizes the amount of work that's been going on along our lakes and what an incredible jewel that is in our city. But it's not unrecognized in our city that the riverfront is the birthplace of our city, that this is a place for refocus and re-energizing. And along the grand rounds, when we had citizens from our community, from north and from northeast, having those connections, really recognizing those forgotten neighborhoods, those communities who have been not linked up with the lakes, but in addition, not linked up with our great riverfront. So I can say that as a person who works in the city, that is one of my personal goals, one of our goals in the city, along with Meet Minneapolis and other partnerships that we are developing to make this a whole city that includes each and every one of us.
Other questions?
You mentioned that the progress will be bipartisan. Bring politics into the issue a bit.
I said non-partisan.
Non-partisan, excuse me. I guess there's a difference.
That may be pretty naive, but
what concrete things can we ask of the people who represent us in both the city council and the state government to do to accomplish what you'd like to see?
Well, the programs obviously keep changing, but the legacy grant program that went into effect 2 years ago wound up with a distribution a distribution formula that people are fairly confident is going to kind of remain as roughly the distribution to different cities, Met Council, so on and so forth for projects. And so I think the leg up that the Twin Cities have in that, and that this system becomes the framework to bring a project forward. You can kind of with confidence show how it's going to complete a link, and then will contribute to other pieces. And so strategically, I think that's one of the initiatives that seems to be for this foreseeable future, knock on wood, seems to be protected, because it is, unless they repeal the half-cent sales tax. So.
I'd like to add to that too. One of the magic things about that constitutional amendment that passed in 2008 that Minnesota voters so resoundingly supported is that it's for history, it's for art, it's for clean water, it's for habitat, and it's for parks. And so what Tim was referring to is the parks money and how that's divided. But when you talk about the Mississippi River, it runs through all those aspects of our lives, and identifying projects that tie into each of those, I think, is something that we need to talk to our elected officials and decision makers about. what are we doing to improve our water quality here in the Twin Cities, and how can that state money help us? The clean water focus is often in rural areas because the agricultural issues there are so profound, but there are opportunities in the metro as well. And same with habitat. We have an international bird flyway here. It's of international significance. There should be some state funding for habitat here as well. So it's making a case for the importance of this area for the whole state and the health of our state. Take Tom and then Chuck.
Tim or Cordelia, how important do you think it is to better connect our downtowns to the river in order for our identity to be strengthened as river cities?
Well, I think the fact that you said they're river cities is a real is almost the answer. They are laid out from the river, the landings. Cordelia mentioned Red Wing is maybe one of the most interesting river towns, the way the grid kind of skews out from the main landing. I mean, you experience Red Wing from the river. You experience St. Paul from the upper landing and the lower landing. And then you now can experience Minneapolis that way as well. I think from a romantic or a business recruitment approach, how would you bring the CEO of some company, if you pick them up at the airport, how would you bring them into town? I was just thinking about, I wasn't thinking about your question, but thinking about it the other day. I think communities go to great lengths to kind of stage their presentation, which is kind of boosterism, but they also quickly get back to what the qualities of that are. So it would be a little bit roundabout, but in a St. Paul visit, you could imagine somebody flying into the airport, getting down to or coming into Red Wing, and then taking the train up to Union Depot, and you arrive in St. Paul and in Lower Town in the light rail. That's a very different impression than driving in I-94. Now, obviously you want to be able to make it in that time or use the transit system, but communities do go to great lengths to promote themselves, and the quickest path to selecting is usually not down the freeway corridor when you're comparing it off against other amenities. So to your question about the idea of it being a river city and the downtown's connection, I think the other challenging piece really is that both with St. Anthony Falls and just the whole configuration around the falls and the locks, it's not a real conducive. It's not a port in a way. It's not where you can have river traffic yet coming and going from the Minneapolis side. The St. Paul side, the landings were the upper landing and lower landing on either side of downtown, and downtown's 100 feet up above the river, great at flood times, but a little bit difficult from an access point of view. Pat Nunley's bike map neglected the hills of drawing those lines straight across St. Paul on Randolph Street or whatever, where you go to an area called Highland, which is aptly named. And so you've got that bluff rise, so the topography in the Twin Cities is a big part of it. So I think the idea of reconnecting, and our mission for a long time at the Riverfront Corporation has been reconnecting St. Paul to the Mississippi River. And a term came out of that is to talk about the receding industrial glacier. The real magic of Ben Thompson's Great River Park image was not well, first of all, he didn't build a festival market, which a lot of people were relieved about because he was the pioneer of that type of development. But the second thing was he basically just filled the river valley in trees. The remarkable part about that, most of those trees weren't there. That was all an industrial riverfront. And so the idea of reconnecting to a landscape that really is 100 years old until it was changed, and going back to that is where the potential is. Now, I think one of our challenges is the term surface water management. How do you manage industrial working river traffic with recreational and or professionally operated excursion boats? And it's pretty exciting. You can watch it watch it on a weekend day in St. Paul. The picture I had up there of Flutock, where there were over 200 boats in the channel, presented some operational issues to people, Coast Guard and others.
To chime in too on the Minneapolis view, Tom Hope I met with on Friday. He's the lead, the chair of the board of the Downtown Improvement District and the president of the Hennepin Theater Trust. And I was talking with him about his view of the city and the health of the city. And he said, it isn't about getting people to the river, it's about the river coming into our city. It's about the green fingers coming up as much as it is the people going down. And I thought that was very perceptive, because part of it is how we develop our downtown and how green it is and how that resonates with it being a river city. I want to recognize Tom Layton as the city planner for the Above the Falls area and all the work that you're doing to inspire us, think toward the future as well. So thanks, Tom, for being here tonight. We're going to take one more question. Oh.
Would you say something about signage as well? The increased signage about the river?
Yeah, actually that's part of the presentation
Oh.
next. Yeah. Well, the second part of the Upriver Forums will be kind of giving you a little snapshot of what kinds of things, like Mary referred to, are proposed. And I think, is it Dave? Dave earlier asked, what can we do? What is it that elected officials need to hear about river? We will spend a little bit of time about that. And Tim, if you could unplug yours and plug it in here, we'll be all set. We'll take one more question. And actually, I want to hear from David Norback from RSP Architects, an international firm, about when you go to other parts of the country or the world, what perceptions are of our city and how important the river is in our region. But Chuck and then David.
Comment or question about what city officials can do. I think when I look at that grid and realize the frameworks of things that have happened over that grid, many of these things have come from government's activities. Midtown Greenway, the Cedar Lake Trails, I mean, name it. We've had a lot of input. Hennepin County recognized the value of the Stone Arch Bridge. Had they not purchased that, we would not be enjoying that. But all of this started with groups of people just like this. A lot of people at a community level working and asking, how can we make things better? And I think that came as part of this forum. How do we involve ourselves with this activity to work with the electeds? Pass this over to David.
So you can talk. The one comment I'd make, I guess, is you talk about my millions of miles of travel, but the great river cities of Europe that have so many years and decades, centuries on us development, seem to have what St. Paul's getting now to a certain degree is really active riverfronts. Not just Minneapolis is so much more abstract, probably because of the industrial legacy there that some of the European capitals that are based on river frontage have these really active urban areas that people are drawn to and accommodated. So my biggest observation there. Thanks, Jim.
So it sounds like, David, you'd love to see above the falls sports, more canoeing, kayaking, and boating on the river. That'd be more active use. Great. Well, we're going to take a moment right now, a little bit of a break, but usually at the beginning of these forums, we go around the room and just say your name and what your relationship to the river is. Do you live in the central riverfront, the upper river? I know there are a lot of people, but it really actually helps us learn more about the community on the riverfront here. And then what we'll do is we'll talk briefly about the Above the Falls plan and the work that Tom Layton and others at the city are leading, the Above the Falls Citizen Advisory Committee, the Park Board, and the Minneapolis Riverfront Partnership, and hopefully give you some teasers about what you can do to stay involved on the riverfront. So if we might start at the beginning, Mary's going to help with a microphone. You can just say your name and what brought you here tonight, your relationship to the river if you live in the central or upper river areas. Thanks.
Ciara Schlipping, I'm the Columbia Park neighborhood rep on AFCAT. That's up in northeast Minneapolis. And I've always lived near the river, never had the pleasure of living right on it, but you know, Mother Nature doesn't always want people living there anyway. But I've never lived more than 5 miles from the river, so that's one of my connections.
You have to put your mouth really close to it.
Hi, I'm Bill Conway, and I'm a neighborhood resident living near the North City.
I'm Joe Ranswell, and I live in the Marcy Homes neighborhood right near
Ted Tucker, also Marcy Holmes neighborhood, and previous member of the Above the Falls Committee.
Hi, I'm Jan Lyson. I live where the Midtown Greenway runs into the parkway, or the river, so that's great. But I also work in North Minneapolis on West Broadway, so I'm very interested in the Above the Falls.
Dear Jana Yontas, I'm from the Hawthorne neighborhood. We're contiguous to the river.
Chuck Sullivan, many years active on riverfront issues, AFCAC, and the Minneapolis Riverfront Partnership.
David Norbeck, RSP Architects. I get to work a block from the river in Minneapolis, and I live a block from the river in St. Paul, board member with MRP.
I'm Layton, city planner with the city of Minneapolis.
I'm Bob Scroggins. I worked for the MCDA until the year 2000, and I worked on the upriver plan, and I came tonight to see what you've done to my plan.
Great that you're here, Bob. Hopefully we'll make you proud.
John Crosby, local resident, live on the river and been involved with river projects through Trust for Public Land.
I'm Dave Smith. I live in southwest Minneapolis, and my interest is in the history of the park system and what we can learn from it going forward.
Larry Delahaye, I'm a resident of
Sue Delahaye.
You have to raise them up.
Sue Delahaye, I also live in the river downtown, and the river's my backyard, so I think the sea is really happening.
I'm Jerry Chardelli. I live by Lake Calhoun. I'm an avid cyclist, so I use these trails that are seen on the maps here extensively. And of course, one of the great destinations is the Stone Arch Bridge, and also the trails are so on or crossing the river. It's great. But if there's a meeting that relates to water in any shape, lake, river, pond, I'm likely to be there.
Hi, my name is Ray Moore. I'm a resident at Carlisle. I used to live out in Eden Prairie, and I moved down here specifically to live on the riverfront and be part of the riverfront neighborhood.
I'm Chris Kelfkin, representative from Sheridan neighborhood, and I live 3 blocks off the river.
I'm Scott Breland. I'm a park board commissioner. I'm a watershed commissioner for the Mississippi Watershed Management Organization. I live in Seward, about 3 from River Gorge, going through Gorge of the Mississippi River. I'm a river rat.
I'm Ken Searle. I just moved here about a year and a half ago from Minnetonka, so I'm familiar with water, and we live right down the street.
Kim Esslinger, and we live in the neighborhood and enjoy the river every day.
Dave Tingham, Mill District residents, and as my lovely wife said, we enjoy the river every day.
Jay Coles. I live in St. Paul, but my office overlooks St. Anthony Falls. I had the distinct pleasure of being involved in helping light the underside of the Stone Arch Bridge, which gives me great pleasure all the time. And I've also been a fan of Tim's for many years. As a resident of St. Paul, I've been very active in their Riverfront Corporation. I love following all things Mississippi and Twin Cities.
Kent Peterson. I live in southeast Minneapolis. I work in the west end of St. Paul, both of which are close to the river, and I love it.
Yeah, Mary would do that to me. I'm Pat Gavidra from the Marshall Terrace neighborhood that Mary also lives in. I'm displaced from the headwaters of the Minnesota River. Lived on the lake up there with that 100 feet out my front door. Now I'm, 2 blocks from the Mississippi.
I'm John Crippen. I work at the Minnesota Historical Society and had the pleasure of being here in Mill City for 4 years, so I got to work on the river and the history of this place, and I'm currently on the board of the Minneapolis Riverfront Partnership.
Ken Bedell, I'm the plant director for the Riverside Power Plant for Xcel Energy and on the board of the Minneapolis Riverfront Partnership.
And that plant is celebrating its 100 years of operation, so look for that in August.
Indeed. I'm Paul Mandelman. I'm with Xcel Energy also. I do community relations, and I know quite a few of you. I work with Kent.
Patrick Funstein. I work here at Mill City Museum and live in St. Paul, so I travel up and down river, except I use the streets.
My name is Carolyn Espy, and I am a recent transplant from Albuquerque, New Mexico. We moved here in November, and we specifically live in the Sheraton neighborhood to be near the river. And I don't drive a car, so I ride my bike to work, which is downtown.
My name is Peggy Coachella, and I volunteer time in the Hawthorne neighborhood in North Minneapolis. I'm interested in water quality issues like drainage and stuff that goes right into the river along the shorelines, and I'm interested in the bicycle connections that you're talking about going east and west.
My name is Brian Kellyman. Peggy is my mate here. We're actually quite involved in the Hawthorne Community Environmental, which involves with the water quality of the Mississippi and bike roads.
I'm John White. I'm an urban studies undergraduate at U, and I live on Franklin and Seward, right on the river.
I'm Don McDaniel. I live in South Minneapolis. I'm working on Masters of Public Administration at Campbell. I've taken an interest in the riverfront.
I'm Bruce Nolan. I'm on the board of Weber Camden Neighborhood Group in North Minneapolis. And I live about half a mile.
And Bruce, you're a member of Above the Falls Citizen Advisory Committee as well, right? Thank you.
I'm Pat Dunley. I work at the University of Minnesota. I coordinate the River Life Partnership, which connects our teaching and research with programs of people working on river sustainability.
Barbara Sullivan. I sit on the Citizens Advisory Board of Above the Falls, and I represent for the non-contiguous Northeast districts. And Cheryl Grams. I volunteer with the visitor experience on the Central Riverfront.
Jim Linsky, and I live at River West, 2 blocks down, overlooking the locks, and we're pretty excited to be there. It's a wonderful place to be.
Jane Dado, River West. We enjoy the river every day.
I'm Lauren Maker. I live in the Victory neighborhood, and I'm a representative on Above the Falls Committee for the non-contiguous north side neighborhoods. And when I have international guests that come into the city, I drive from the airport up the West River Road to downtown because it gives people a whole different view of what the city looks like. Clara as a river resident across the river.
Meg Forney, I'm on the Above the Falls. I'm the chair of the Above the Falls Citizens Advisory Committee. I get so excited about the whole Above the Falls. I feel it's the last frontier in the city, and it truly will be our economic engine for the Gila area.
Leo White, River West.
Linda Mack. I grew up on the river in Keokuk, Iowa, but I don't live on the river now, but I've had the opportunity to cover it as a writer and to cover the rebirth of the Minneapolis riverfront as well as the St. Paul riverfront, and I'm now vice chair of the Minneapolis Riverfront Partnership.
Mike Trump, local residents do a lot of biking.
Jose Amin, I work for Cargill, but living here at the car line, I'm very happy to enjoy a great view from the falls and locks of the day, so just interested in learning more about my neighborhood.
I'm John, I'm John Albers, and I live at the Carlisle as well. I moved there from Lake Harriet about 3 years ago, and I love it. Thank you.
Denise Wolf, and I've lived in the Mill District here for over 6 years, and have a nice little snippet of a view of Stone Arch Bridge and the river from the condo.
Carletta Sweet, River West resident, and I'm an alternate director on the Minneapolis Riverfront Partnership.
Doug Bernier, I live in River West. Moved here about 6 to 7 years ago, and enjoy the view of the river and the falls and the locks and the Stone Arch Bridge from my living room every day, and try to walk along the trails of the river every day, even in bad weather. And I get very involved in the history and the green space
Hi, Diane Hofstad, City Council member for the 3rd Ward, representing the largest stretch of the riverfront. I am also the founding member of the Mississippi Riverfront Partnership and currently chair. I also represent the City of Minneapolis on the Mississippi Watershed Organization.
I'm Tony Hofstad, and I'm on the riverfront. I'm on Buffalo Falls board, and I'm a representative from the city of West Railway. I'm on the river, and I've lived my entire life being about 3 blocks from the river, and it's such a resource. I'm grateful.
Barbara Washmore, Northeastern North News newspapers, and I live in Sheridan.
I'm Kathleen Anderson, and I live down the street at the North Star, and I've lived there 11 years. I think I'm one of the pioneers. I love every minute. I've loved every minute.
Last but not least, Kirk Hokinson from River West. I want to say we've got a good showing from River West tonight.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you all for listening to each other. It's unusual for a group this big to go through and listen to everybody, but there really is a variety here. People who don't necessarily live here but are interested, and people who didn't grow up here who moved here. I grew up on Long Island Sound and outside New York City. I came here to school, and I stayed for the river. The river really has a power and magic in the community that helps build community. So that's what we'll talk a little bit more about, is how it does build community, what's going on, and what you can be involved in. Just very quickly.
I just want to quickly say, I grew up on the Hudson River in New York, and one of the unique things in the town I grew up in is I was probably a mile and a half from the river, but I lived on the river. We all lived on the river. And I came to Minneapolis 30 years, I came longer than that, but 30 years ago, I started asking around for river groups in Minneapolis, and there were none. And look at us now, isn't this exciting? It's really great.
Great. So, and thank you, Bob Scroggins, for your work in getting the Above the Falls plan. So we'll just talk briefly about some things that are going on and then how you can be involved. So the Above the Falls policy review. Oops, wrong arrow. Above the Falls area starts at Plymouth Bridge and goes north. And some real features, and I took this straight from Tom Layton's work. One of the fascinating features about it, it's near downtown. It's also near transportation corridors, both the river and rail and highway, and lots of active employment clusters. It is not an area where there are no jobs and there's hollowed out community. There is a lot going on there already. The other thing that's fascinating, and Mary experiences this firsthand, is that there are passive parks. There are parks right next to industrial sites. So Marshall Concrete is across from Mary's house, on Marshall. So there's a really fascinating mix of uses there that makes it somewhat chaotic and also somewhat exciting.